The grim-faced men sat uneasily on their horses, the beasts shifting and snorting as if they too could smell the rot in the air. For days they had tracked the runaway, their hunt ending here, at the sullen edge of the great Cypress swamp. Their leader, Alistair Beaumont, stared into the murky expanse, his face a mask of fury stretched taut over a brittle frame of pride. The air, thick with mist and the cloying sweetness of decay, seemed to press in on them, silencing the birds and muffling the sound of their own breathing. It was a hired tracker named Jeb who saw it first. He raised a trembling hand, his finger pointing not at a body or a piece of torn cloth, but at a small, impossible light. There, floating perfectly upright in the gray, still water, was a little tin and glass lantern. Its flame, a steady, warm teardrop of gold, burned defiantly against the gloom. It did not flicker. It did not dim. It simply was. Beaumont's rage, so hot and potent only a moment before, cooled into a superstitious dread that crawled over his skin like a cold serpent. He could not fathom how it remained lit, how it floated so serenely on the black water that had swallowed the woman who carried it. The other men murmured amongst themselves, their bravado dissolving into a palpable fear. They didn't know this was the moment a woman became a myth. They didn't know her light would outlast their memory. They only knew that the swamp had taken her and left this impossible burning question in her place. Before we carry on, please hit the subscribe button to make my day, and let me know where you are watching from in the comments. 2 weeks earlier, the world had been a much smaller, more suffocating place. It was contained within the polished surfaces of the Beaumont dining room, where Dinah Cooper worked her hands raw. She moved with a practiced fluid grace, her cloth whispering over the ornate silver, chasing away the tarnish of the humid Memphis air. The work was meticulous, endless, a cycle of dullness and shine that mirrored the days of her life. Through the tall, paned window, she could see the edge of the great Cypress swamp, a dark, jagged line of teeth against the bruised purple and orange of the setting Sunday. It was a place of fear, a place whispered about in hushed tones, filled with snakes and gators and sucking mud. But to Dinah, it was also a place of profound mystery, an alternative to the suffocating order of the plantation. Her hands, chapped and sore, moved with a precision born of long practice and the constant threat of punishment. Her internal world was a quiet storm of gnawing hunger, of a weariness that had settled deep into her bones, and of a carefully banked resentment for the casual cruelty of her enslavers, Alistair and his wife, Eleanor. She paused, her breath fogging a silver platter. For a moment, she tried to find her own face in the reflection, but the curved surface distorted her features into a grotesque mask, a stranger with wide, haunted eyes and a mouth pulled into a permanent grimace. She looked away from the monstrous version of herself and focused instead on the reflection of the window, on the distant, dark line of the swamp. It was a place without walls, a place that did not answer to the dinner bell or the overseer's whip. The thought was both terrifying and intoxicating. The spell was broken by the sharp, imperious voice of Eleanor Beaumont, who had entered the room as silently as a cat. She swept a gloved finger over the surface of a silver candlestick. Her eyes narrowed, searching for imperfection. She found it, a microscopic flaw that only she could see, a tiny speck of resistance that Dinah's tired hands had missed. Eleanor held it up to the fading light. Her lip curled in disgust. "Is this the best you can do, girl?" she asked, her voice dripping with condescension. "This filth dishonors my table. You will do it again, and you will not eat until I can see my own angelic face in it without blemish." Dinah kept her eyes downcast, her face a mask of quiet obedience. But behind it, a deep, simmering hatred churned. She took the candlestick without a word, the cold weight of the silver a familiar burden. In that polished cage, surrounded by the trappings of a wealth built on her bondage, the dark line of the swamp on the horizon seemed less like a threat and more like a promise. Later that night, in the cramped, stifling air of the slave quarters, Dinah moved with quiet purpose. The small room was thick with the scent of sweat and wood smoke, and the sound of exhausted breathing from the other bodies crammed onto thin pallets. From a loose floorboard beneath her own meager bedding, she retrieved a small, carefully hidden object. It was a lantern, not plantation property, not something stolen from the big house, but her own. It had been a gift given to her years ago by an old, itinerant preacher who had passed through, a man with eyes that seemed to see a world beyond this one, a man who spoke of a different kind of light, an inner flame that no master could extinguish. The lantern was her most prized possession, a secret symbol of that other world, a tangible piece of hope in the crushing darkness. She held it in her lap, its cool metal a comfort in the humid night. With a soft, clean rag she had saved, she polished its glass panes until they were clear as water. She checked the wick, trimming it with her fingernail, and unscrewed the cap to ensure the small tin of oil she had been hoarding, drop by precious drop, was still full. She did not light it. The time for that was not yet come. For now, it was enough to just hold it, to feel its potential in her hands. A voice, low and raspy as a dry leaf, spoke from the shadows. "That little light won't scare away the big darkness, child." It was Elara, an elderly woman whose body was a roadmap of a brutal life. One eye was gone, the socket a puckered scar, and her arms were cross-hatched with the silvery tracks of the whip, but her remaining eye was sharp, missing nothing. She had been watching Dinah's ritual, her gaze knowing, not the darkness in the hearts of men. Elara finished, her voice a low rumble. Dinah clutched the lantern a little tighter. "It's not for them," she whispered, her voice fierce. "It's for me." Elara shifted on her pallet, the straw rustling. She looked past Dinah, her gaze seeming to penetrate the thin walls of the cabin and travel out into the night, toward the swamp that bordered their world. "The swamp has its own lights," she said cryptically, her voice barely a whisper, "and its own darkness. You best know which is which before you go following one." Elara's words hung in the air, a gentle warning that settled over Dinah like the evening mist. The lantern in her hands felt heavier now, not just a symbol of hope, but a tool, a key to a place Elara seemed to know with an intimacy that was both frightening and fascinating. The breaking point came the next afternoon, as sudden and shattering as the sound of breaking porcelain. A young boy named Leo, no more than 8 years old, was helping to clear the parlor. Dinah cared for him like a little brother, his bright, curious spirit a small candle against the gloom. His hands were too small, his attention too fleeting, and a priceless porcelain vase from Europe slipped from his grasp. It hit the polished floor with a sickening crack that echoed through the house's oppressive silence. a sound that seemed to rip a hole in the fabric of their world. Alistair Beaumont appeared in the doorway almost instantly, his face flushed with rage. He was not a man who tolerated mistakes, especially when they cost him money. He saw the terrified boy and the shattered remains of his property, and his fury coalesced into a cold, sadistic resolve. He would make an example of him. He grabbed Leo by the arm, his fingers digging into the boy's thin bicep, and began to drag the crying, pleading child towards the back door, towards the whipping post that stood like a skeletal sentinel in the yard. Something inside Dinah, some carefully constructed dam of fear and self-preservation that had held for years, finally broke. The simmering resentment, the quiet hatred, the desperate yearning, all of it boiled over in a single, clarifying instant. She saw not just Leo, but every child, every man, every woman who had ever suffered under the lash. She saw the future stretching out before them, an endless road of pain and humiliation, and she could not bear it. Without thinking, without calculating the consequences, she moved. She stepped directly into Beaumont's path, placing her body between the master and the terrified boy. "Please, Master Beaumont," she begged, her voice trembling but clear. "It was an accident. He's just a boy. Punish me instead." For a moment, Beaumont was too stunned to react. Then his face contorted with a fresh wave of fury at her insolence. He shoved her hard, sending her stumbling back against a table. "You will learn your place," he snarled, his voice low and venomous. "All of you will." He turned and continued to drag Leo out into the yard, the boy's cries growing fainter as the door swung shut. Dinah stood there, her heart pounding, the spot on her shoulder where he had pushed her burning like a brand. The sight of Leo's small, trembling body, the sound of his terror, and the look of sheer sadistic pleasure on Beaumont's face had burned away any remaining trace of hesitation. Her resolve, once a flickering dream, now hardened into cold, sharp steel. She could not stay. She would not stay. That night, she would run. The night air in the quarters was a thick, suffocating blanket woven from the smells of sweat, fear, and sorrow. Leo's whimpers were small, broken sounds, like a wounded bird trapped in the dark. Dinah knelt beside his pallet, dabbing his back with a cool, damp rag. The leather of the whip had left angry red welts that crisscrossed his tender skin, a brutal map of Beaumont's rage. Each soft touch of the cloth made the boy flinch, his small body trembling not just from the pain, but from the deep, soul-shaking terror that had taken root in him. Dinah's heart felt like a cold, heavy stone in her chest. The fury that had propelled her in front of Beaumont had cooled, leaving behind a resolve as hard and clear as winter ice. As she worked, a melody rose in her throat, almost of its own accord. It was a low, humming lullaby, a song her mother used to sing in the quiet moments stolen between dusk and dawn. It was a song of the river, of the birds that could fly north, of a land where a person's soul was their own. It was a freedom song, and as she hummed, she made a silent vow, a promise so fierce it felt like a prayer. She swore it to the sleeping figures around her, to the memory of her mother, and most of all, to the trembling boy in front of her. This would not be his future. He would not grow up with his back a ledger of another man's tempers. The desperate, fiery impulse of the afternoon had transformed into a calculated plan, each step laid out in the darkness of her mind. Freedom was no longer a distant, hazy dream. It had become a sharp, immediate necessity. It was not the abstract notion the preacher had spoken of, but the tangible right to stand between a child and a whip, the right to feel the sun on her skin and know it was her own sun, warming her own day. It was the right to walk in a direction of her own choosing, even if that direction led into the dreaded heart of the Cypress swamp. Over the next few days, Dinah moved through her chores with a new, almost invisible purpose. Her body performed the familiar tasks of a slave, but her mind was a whirlwind of secret calculations. Every action became twofold, a performance for the eyes of her captors and a furtive step toward her own liberation. While weeding Eleanor's prized rose garden, her fingers, calloused and quick, worked beneath the surface of the soil. They identified the tough, stringy roots of the wild yams Elara had once pointed out, tubers that could be boiled or eaten raw. She would loosen them, then cover them again with dirt, marking their location in her mind. Later, under the cover of dusk, she would return and slip them into a small cloth bag. The earthy smell of the roots, a scent of deep, wild nourishment, felt like the first taste of a different life. While mending a pile of rough work shirts in the evening, the needle became her conspirator. With deft, practiced stitches, she sewed a hidden pocket deep into the folds of her own worn dress, a secret compartment just large enough for her most vital supplies. The rough texture of the homespun cloth against her skin was a constant reminder of her plan, a secret she wore against her own body. The most dangerous task was cleaning the smokehouse. The air inside was thick and heavy, stinging her eyes with the rich, acrid scent of hickory smoke and cured pork. While her hands scrubbed the greasy wooden racks, her eyes darted about. When the overseer's attention was drawn away by a commotion in the yard, she moved with a speed she didn't know she possessed. Her hand shot out, grabbing a small, hard piece of salted ham from a hook. It was greasy and heavy in her palm. She quickly wrapped it in a piece of spare cloth she had brought for this purpose and shoved it deep into her apron. The constant, thrumming fear of being watched was a physical presence, a hand hovering just above her shoulder. Every rustle of leaves, every unexpected footstep sent a jolt of pure adrenaline through her veins, making her heart hammer against her ribs. But the fear did not paralyze her. It sharpened her senses, making the world vivid and immediate. The escape was no longer a dream. It was becoming tangible, a collection of stolen roots and secret stitches, a greasy parcel that smelled of smoke and freedom. Dinah knew that roots and stolen meat were not enough. She needed knowledge, the kind that was not written in books but carried in the blood and bones of survivors. She sought out Elara. She found the old woman at the edge of the property, where the manicured grounds of the plantation frayed into the wild tangle of the swamp's perimeter. Elara sat on a fallen log, her gnarled fingers moving with surprising speed as she wove a basket from strips of river cane. The rhythmic rasp of the cane was a peaceful, ancient sound. Dinah approached not with the deference of a young slave to an elder, but with the focused urgency of a student seeking a master. She did not ask for permission to speak. She asked for knowledge. She held out one of the roots she had gathered. "Is this the one?" she asked, her voice low. Elara took the root, her single eye examining it with intense scrutiny. She broke it in half, sniffed it, then nodded slowly. She then pointed to a nearby vine with similar-looking leaves. She plucked a leaf, crushed it between her thumb and forefinger, and held it to Dinah's nose. The smell was acrid and bitter, entirely different from the earthy scent of the edible root. "One feeds you," Elara said, her voice raspy. "The other puts you in the ground. The swamp don't tell you which is which. You have to know." Dinah's voice was barely a whisper, but it was filled with a desperate intensity. "The swamp. What must I know?" Elara looked away from her basket, her gaze fixed on the dark wall of cypress trees. "You must know that it breathes," she said, her voice taking on a strange melodic cadence. "It is alive. It does not care for the laws of men, for masters or slaves. You must learn its rhythm. The water always wants to move south, toward the great river. Listen to it. Moss is a shy thing. It grows on the north side of the cypress, away from the strong Sunday. The hoot of an owl can mean a predator is near, or it can mean the path is clear. You must learn the difference in its voice." Elara reached into a small pouch at her waist and pulled out a smaller deerskin bundle tied with a leather thong. She pressed it into Dinah's hand. It was surprisingly heavy. "Dried herbs," she explained, "yarrow for fever, and snake-a-root for the bite. It is not a cure, mind you. Nothing is a cure for a moccasin's kiss, but it may buy you time. The rest is up to your spirit and your feet." Dinah closed her hand around the pouch, the soft leather a warm, solid weight in her palm. A silent understanding passed between them. This was more than a gift of herbs. It was a transfer of knowledge, an anointing. Elara was entrusting her with generations of survival wisdom, a legacy far more valuable than any of Beaumont's silver. Dinah was no longer just running from something. She was learning how to run to something, to a life hidden within the swamp's dangerous embrace. Alistair Beaumont was a cruel man, but he was not a fool. He had built his fortune on his ability to read the value of a man or a horse, and he knew how to spot the subtle signs of a spirit about to break. In the days following the incident with the vase, he noticed a change in Dinah. The perfect, cowed obedience he demanded was still there on the surface, her body still bowed, her voice still soft. But it had become a shell. Behind her eyes, the familiar flicker of fear had been replaced by something he couldn't quite name. A deep, unnerving stillness. A watchfulness that made the hairs on his arms stand on end. It was a look of terrifying patience. He began to watch her more closely, his gaze following her as she moved through the house. He started assigning her extra, pointless tasks, designed to keep her on her feet late into the night, to grind her down with exhaustion and leave her no time for thought. He ordered her to repolish silver that was already gleaming, to scrub floors that were already spotless. After dark, he took to walking the perimeter of the slave quarters himself, foregoing his usual evening brandy. His heavy boots crunched loudly on the gravel path, a deliberate, menacing rhythm designed to remind everyone who slept within those thin walls that they were surrounded, that there was no escape. One evening, as he stood in the shadows watching the dim light from the quarters, his overseer, a cruel and sycophantic man named Finch, approached him. "Everything quiet, sir?" Finch asked. Beaumont didn't take his eyes off the cabins. "Too quiet," he muttered. He finally turned to Finch, his own eyes narrowed with suspicion. "There's a look in that girl's eye," he said, his voice a low growl. "The same look my father's prize mare had just before she kicked the stable wall down and broke her own leg trying to get out. She'd decided she'd had enough of the bridle. He jabbed a finger toward the quarters. Watch her. Watch them all. I feel a storm coming, Finch, and I mean to be ready for it. The weight of Beaumont's paranoia settled over the plantation like a physical shroud. Dinah felt it in the way his eyes lingered on her, in the exhaustion that settled deeper into her bones from the pointless nightly labors. She knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the core, that her window for escape was closing. His suspicion was a cage being built around her, bar by invisible bar. She had to leave soon, before he found a reason to break her for good, before her light, like that of the prize mare, was extinguished against the walls of his prison. The night chose itself. It came without a moon, the sky a swatch of black velvet, starless and vast, a thick, wet fog, born from the union of the cool autumn air and the warm breath of the river, began to roll inland, a silent gray tide that promised to swallow the world. It was the perfect cover, a gift from a sky that had never offered her anything before. Inside the stifling quarters, the air was stale with the scent of sleep. The only sounds were the soft sighs and occasional murmurs of the dozen other souls packed into the small space, each lost in their own brief reprieve from bondage. Dinah rose from her pallet with a slowness that was agonizing. Every tiny movement was a calculated risk, every shift of weight a potential betrayal. She dressed in the absolute dark, her fingers knowing the worn fabric of her dress by heart. She secured her small, precious bundle of supplies, the lumpy shapes of the stolen roots and the greasy cloth of the salted meat, a secret weight against her body. Then, her hands, trembling slightly, closed around the cool, familiar metal of the lantern. She took one last, lingering look at the sleeping form of Leo. In the oppressive blackness, she could see nothing, but she could feel his presence, could hear the soft, even rhythm of his breathing, now free from the pained whimpers of the previous nights. Her heart ached with a love so fierce it was a physical pain, a tearing in her chest. She wanted to wake him, to tell him where she was going, to make him a promise she could keep. But she knew that any word, any touch, would be a betrayal of his safety and her own. Her fingers found the small, crudely carved wooden bird he had pressed into her hand weeks ago, a secret gift he had whittled with a stolen knife. She clutched it for a moment, its rough edges digging into her palm. A final, silent goodbye. She slipped it deep into her pocket, a tangible piece of the life she was leaving behind, a reason to keep moving forward. Her bare feet found the floorboards. She lifted one foot, then the other, a ghost in her own life. Then, a single board beneath her heel let out a low, groaning creak, a sound that in the profound silence of the cabin seemed as loud as a gunshot, as explosive as a shattering vase. She froze, her body rigid, her breath caught in her throat. The sound echoed in her ears, a scream in the quiet room. She waited, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs, for a voice to call out, for a body to stir, for the spell of sleep to be broken. But there was nothing. The breathing around her continued, deep and even. The night held its peace. After a minute that stretched into an eternity, she let out a slow, silent breath and continued her spectral journey to the door. She slipped through the opening and into the night, the damp, earthy smell of the fog a welcome shock to her senses. The cold dew on the grass soaked her feet instantly, a chilling baptism into her new world. The darkness outside was even more profound than in the cabin. A solid, oppressive wall of black that seemed to press in on her from all sides. She was an island in an ocean of nothing. The open ground between the slave quarters and the distant jagged line of the swamp was a moonlit field of execution on most nights. But tonight, the fog was her accomplice. It swirled around her ankles, clinging to her dress, muffling the sound of her own terrified breathing. She moved like a phantom, her body low to the ground, using the deeper shadows of the smokehouse and the long, dark line of a split-rail fence for cover. This was the most dangerous part of her journey. 100 yards of open space where a single stray glance from a window in the big house could mean the end. Her every sense was on fire, her ears straining to catch the slightest sound, her eyes trying to pierce the thick, rolling mist. A dog barked in the distance, a sharp, percussive sound that ripped through the night. Dinah dropped to the ground, pressing her body into the wet grass, her heart leaping into her throat. She lay perfectly still, her face turned toward the sound, every muscle in her body screaming at her to run, to scramble back to the false safety of the quarters. But her resolve, forged in the fire of Leo's pain, held her fast. She counted the seconds, each one a lifetime, her mind a whirlwind of terror. She waited for the sound of running feet, for the shouts of men, for the baying to grow closer. The barking continued for another minute, a frantic, lonely sound, and then, as suddenly as it had begun, it stopped. The silence that rushed back in was even more terrifying, a void filled with her own ragged pulse. She waited, counting to 100 twice before she dared to move again, rising slowly, cautiously, a wraith emerging from the earth. She reached the edge of the woods, the point of no return. The trees loomed before her, their branches like skeletal arms reaching out of the fog. The air that flowed from between their trunks was different, cooler, smelling of damp earth, of decay, and of a wildness that was both terrifying and thrilling. This was the border between the world she knew and the world she had only dreamed of. She took a deep, shuddering breath, the damp air filling her lungs. She set the lantern down on a patch of dry leaves, her hands shaking so badly she could barely work the small metal clasp of her tinderbox. She struck the flint against the steel, once, twice, a third time. A tiny spark flared, a brief, angry star in the darkness. She coaxed it onto the tinder, blowing on it with a gentle, controlled breath until a small, fragile flame caught. With infinite care, she lifted the glass of the lantern and touched the flame to the wick. It sputtered for a moment, threatening to die, and then it caught, blooming into a small, steady, golden light. The flame was no bigger than her thumb, but in the immense, suffocating darkness, it was a Sunday. It was a defiant star. It felt like her own soul, hidden for so long, had finally become visible. She closed the glass. The click of the latch, a sound of finality. She was no longer hiding in the darkness. She was carrying her own light forward. She picked up the lantern, its warm glow pushing back the fog in a small, intimate circle, and stepped into the swamp. The world changed instantly, utterly. The moment her foot left the solid ground of the plantation and sank into the swamp, she was in another realm. The air grew heavy, thick with humidity, and the rich, complex perfume of life and death, of wet earth and rotting leaves, of sweet, cloying blossoms, and the faint, metallic tang of stagnant water. The oppressive silence of the open field was gone, replaced by a deafening chorus of life. A million insects buzzed and chirped. Frogs croaked in a dozen different voices, from deep, guttural bellows to high-pitched, peeping calls. Unseen things moved in the water around her, their splashes and ripples sending fresh waves of fear through her. The water itself was a shock, a startling, invasive cold that seeped instantly into her worn shoes and began to climb her legs, a chilling embrace that seemed to be trying to pull the warmth from her body. The ground beneath her feet was no longer reliable. It was a soft, sucking mud that clung to her ankles, trying to pull her down, to claim her shoes, to hold her in place. With every step, she had to pull her foot free from its greedy grasp. The cypress knees, ancient and gnarled, jutted from the black water, their shapes twisted and monstrous in the dancing, uncertain light of her lantern. They looked like skeletal hands reaching for her, like the bony fingers of the dead trying to claw their way out of the muck. The fog, which had been her ally in the open field, was now a bewildering enemy. It swirled around her, distorting shapes, muffling sounds, and reducing her world to the small 10-foot circle of her lantern's glow. Beyond that circle, there was only a swirling, featureless gray. Panic, cold and sharp, began to set in. She was immediately, terrifyingly disoriented. The path Alara had described, the subtle signs and markers, were impossible to see in the disorienting gloom. Every direction looked the same, a terrifying maze of black water and gray trees. Her heart began to pound with a new, more primal fear. This was not the fear of the whip or the master's voice. This was the fear of being utterly, hopelessly lost, of being swallowed by a world that did not know or care that she existed. She stopped, her breath coming in ragged gasps, the lantern shaking in her hand. She was about to scream, to give in to the terror that was threatening to overwhelm her. But then, through the fog of her own fear, a voice echoed in her mind. Alara's voice, raspy and calm. The swamp breathes. She forced herself to stand still and to close her eyes for just a moment against the swirling chaos. She forced herself to breathe, to match her own breath to the slow, ancient rhythm of the place. She listened, not just with her ears, but with her whole body. She felt the subtle, almost imperceptible pull of the water against her ankles, a gentle but persistent pressure. South, Alara had said. The water wants to move south. She opened her eyes, her panic receding, replaced by a fragile, nascent focus. She had a direction. It was not a path, but it was a start, pushing deeper into the cypress heart, guided only by the small, bobbing circle of her light and the faint tug of the current. Dinah felt a change within herself. The initial wave of terror had passed, leaving behind a heightened state of awareness, a sharp-edged clarity. She was no longer a slave running from a master. She was a creature moving through a wilderness, her survival dependent not on obedience, but on her own senses, her own courage. After what felt like hours of wading through the cold, black water, she came to a wider channel. The current here was stronger, the water blacker and deeper. She probed the edge with her foot, but she could find no bottom. It was too deep to wade, a dark, silent river blocking her path south. Despair, cold and bitter, threatened to return, to be stopped so soon, after coming so far. She thought of turning back, but the image of Beaumont's face, twisted with rage, and the sound of Leo's cries immediately burned that thought away. There was no going back. There was only through. She remembered seeing something, further back, a shape that had registered only in the periphery of her vision. A fallen giant. She had to backtrack, her own trail already swallowed by the shifting water and fog. Her fear, a constant companion, now warred with her stubborn resolve. She pushed back against the current, her legs aching with cold and exertion, her eyes scanning the edge of her light's reach. And then she saw it. A massive cypress log, a casualty of some long-ago storm, lying across the channel. It was half-submerged, its bark slick with a thick, velvety layer of dark green moss, looking as treacherous as a coiled snake. But it was a bridge, holding the lantern high, its precious flame shielded by her own body. She carefully, painstakingly, began to cross. Her bare feet, numb with cold, struggled to find purchase on the slippery, rounded surface. Her body trembled with a combination of cold, fear, and intense physical exertion. With each step, the log seemed to shift and groan beneath her weight. She did not look down at the black, hungry water, but kept her eyes fixed on the far bank. As she moved, a line from the old preacher's sermon, a line she had clung to in the darkest hours, came back to her, and she began to repeat it to herself, her lips barely moving, a silent mantra against the chorus of the swamp. "The light shines in the darkness," she whispered, her voice a thin thread in the vast wilderness, "and the darkness has not overcome it." The words were a rhythm, a focus, a prayer that steadied her trembling limbs. When her foot finally touched the soft, muddy ground of the other side, a wave of relief so profound it was almost painful washed over her. She had done it. She had faced her first great challenge, and she had won. It was a small victory in what she knew would be a long war, but it was a victory nonetheless. It bolstered her confidence. A small, warm coal of hope, glowing brighter in her chest. She was not just a victim of the swamp, a helpless fugitive at its mercy. She was learning its language. She was learning to coexist with it. She was learning to survive. Exhaustion was a heavy, sodden cloak, and by the time the first hint of gray light began to dilute the oppressive blackness of the canopy, Dinah felt as though she could not take another step. Her legs were numb. Her dress was a sheath of cold mud, and every muscle ached with a profound weariness she had never known, not even after 16 hours of labor in the Beaumont house. She found a small hummock of land, a patch of semi-dry earth clustered around the base of 3 cypress trees that grew together like sisters, their roots intertwined to create a solid foundation. She crawled onto it, her body collapsing onto the damp ground, the lantern still clutched in her hand. As dawn filtered through the dense lacework of leaves and moss, the swamp transformed. In the lantern's glow, it had been a place of monstrous shapes and claustrophobic darkness. But in the soft, pearlescent light of morning, it revealed a different character. It was still dangerous, a place of hidden depths and silent predators, but it was also filled with a wild, primeval beauty that stole her breath. Spanish moss, the color of silver and ghosts, dripped from the branches of ancient trees, swaying gently in a breeze she could not feel. The black water, so terrifying in the night, was now a mirror, reflecting the pale sky and the dark silhouettes of the trees. A flash of brilliant blue caught her eye, and she watched as a great heron, disturbed by her presence, took flight, its massive wings beating a slow, powerful rhythm as it lifted itself into the air and disappeared into the mist. The air, however, was not still. It was alive with the oppressive, high-pitched buzzing of 1,000,000 mosquitoes, a hungry cloud that descended on any exposed piece of her skin. She sat up, her back against the rough bark of a cypress, and took out her small parcel of food. She unwrapped the greasy cloth and looked at the piece of salted ham. It was small, barely a handful, but it was hers. She had taken it. She tore off a small piece with her teeth, the salty, smoky flavor exploding in her mouth. It was, without question, the most delicious thing she had ever tasted. It was the taste of defiance, the taste of survival. As she ate, a new feeling, strange and powerful, began to dawn on her, a feeling that was even more profound than the beauty of the swamp or the taste of the meat. For the first time in her entire life, she had woken up, and her time was her own. There was no bell ringing to signal the start of work, no overseer's voice shouting her name, no list of chores to be completed for someone else's comfort. The fear was still there, a cold knot in the pit of her stomach, a constant awareness of the 1,000 ways she could die in this place. But for the first time, that fear was overshadowed by a thrilling, terrifying sense of ownership. This body, this breath, this day, they belonged to her. The thought was so immense, so radical. She was the master of her own weary muscles and her own uncertain future. The sound came from far away, a faint and distant noise that carried strangely across the water. At first, she thought it was the cry of some animal she did not recognize, but then it came again, closer this time, and the blood in her veins turned to ice. It was the baying of hounds, a deep, mournful, hunting sound. Beaumont's search had begun. Panic, white-hot and absolute, seized her. Her first instinct was to run, to scramble blindly through the water. But Ilara's words echoed in her mind, a voice of calm in the storm of her terror. You must learn its rhythm. She could not outrun the dogs, not in this terrain. She had to outthink them. With a trembling hand, she reached for her lantern and, with a painful twist of her heart, blew out the flame. The small, brave light that had been her only comfort was gone, and the world seemed to grow darker, colder. The baying was closer now, a chorus of excited yelps and deep-throated calls. They had her scent. She slid off the hummock and back into the chilling water, her teeth chattering with a combination of cold and fear. She spotted a thicket of tall reeds and cattails a few yards away and pushed toward it, the sucking mud trying to hold her back. She forced her way into the center of the thicket, the sharp leaves scratching at her face and arms, and submerged herself until the black water was up to her chin, her head hidden amongst the dense green stalks. She waited, her body rigid, her ears straining. The sounds of the hunt grew louder, the crashing of bodies through undergrowth, the angry shouts of men. Through a small gap in the reeds, she saw them. They were on a nearby ridge of land, a slightly elevated path that ran parallel to her position. Finch, the overseer, was in the lead, his face red and sweating, his clothes already torn by thorns. 2 other men she recognized from the plantation were with him, their expressions a mixture of excitement and unease. The dogs, 4 of them, strained at their leashes, their noses to the ground, whining with a frustrated confusion. They would follow the scent to the water's edge, and then lose it in the vast, shifting currents of the swamp. She heard Finch's voice, loud and angry, cut through the air. She came this way. The dogs had the scent right to the water, but the water's washing it out. Damn this cursed place. One of the other men spoke, his voice nervous. Maybe a gator got her, Mr. Finch. Finch spat on the ground. Beaumont wants her back, or what's left of her. Spread out. Look for tracks on the other side of this channel. The terror of the hunt was a visceral, living thing inside her. She could feel the vibrations of their movements through the water. Could smell the acrid scent of their sweat and frustration on the air. But as she watched them, clumsy and loud, crashing through the pristine wilderness, a new realization began to take root. They did not belong here. They were intruders, invaders. Their noise, their anger, their frustration, it was all a sign of their powerlessness in this place. She, on the other hand, was silent. She was hidden. She was learning to use the water and the reeds as her allies. In the brutal calculus of the swamp, she had an advantage. They were the hunters, but she was becoming part of the landscape. Days blurred into a disorienting cycle of survival, a rhythm of fear and small triumphs. The world of the Beaumont plantation, with its polished silver and brutal certainties, began to feel like a distant dream, a life that had belonged to someone else. Dinah learned to move with a silence that bordered on invisibility, to place her feet in the water without a splash, to read the subtle shifts in the current and the wind. She learned to identify the edible plants Ilara had shown her. Her diet now a meager but life-sustaining rotation of tough roots, sour berries, and the occasional small fish she managed to trap with her bare hands in shallow pools. She learned to find shelter, a hollow log, a dense thicket, a small cave carved into a bank of earth by the river's current. The fear never left her, but it changed. It was no longer the sharp, humiliating fear of a master's rage, but a clean, primal fear, the fear of a living creature in a world of other living creatures. One afternoon, weak with hunger, she was foraging along the edge of a stagnant bayou. She spotted a cluster of dark, plump berries hanging from a low branch, their color a welcome promise of sweetness. She reached for them, her fingers just inches away, when a sudden movement from above caught her eye. A large water moccasin, thick as her arm and black as polished jet, had been coiled on the branch just above the berries, its own patient hunt disturbed by hers. It did not strike. It simply uncoiled and dropped. A heavy, muscular weight that hit the water with a soft splash, inches from her face. She froze, her hand still outstretched, her body as rigid and still as the cypress knees around her. Terror, pure and absolute, flooded her system, locking her muscles, silencing her breath. The snake surfaced, its flat, triangular head held just above the black water, its lidless black eyes seeming to look right through her. It tasted the air with its forked tongue. Then, with a fluid, unhurried grace, it glided past her, its long body a dark ripple in the murky depths. It disappeared. Dinah did not move. She stayed frozen in that position for a long time, her breath shallow, her heart a slow, heavy drum in her ears. She did not scream. She did not run. The encounter was terrifying, but as the initial shock receded, it left something else in its place, something strangely intimate. The snake had not been cruel. It had not been malicious. It had simply been. It was a reminder, more powerful than any words, that she was not the only dangerous thing in this water. She was not a special victim, not a runaway slave to be hunted. In the eyes of the swamp, she was just another living creature, sharing the same space, the same dangers, the same desperate urge to survive. The fear she felt was purified, stripped of the human cruelty she was so used to. This was a clean fear, the fear of fang and water and the natural order of things. It was a fear she could live with. The fever came on slowly, a creeping chill that started in her bones and could not be warmed by the humid air. At first, she thought it was just the constant exposure to the cold water, but soon, a deep weakness settled over her limbs feeling heavy as waterlogged wood. A violent shivering took hold of her body, and her mind, once sharpened by fear and necessity, became clouded and slow, the world wavering at the edges as if seen through heated air. She knew, with a terrifying certainty, that if she did not find a safe, dry place to hide, the swamp would claim her. Stumbling, her vision blurring, she found a refuge, a hollow in the base of a giant, ancient cypress tree, a space large enough to crawl inside, a dark, woody womb that smelled of damp earth and centuries of slow decay. She crawled into the darkness, pulling her knees to her chest, and collapsed into a state that was neither sleep nor wakefulness. She clutched her unlit lantern to her chest, its cold metal a familiar, solid anchor in a world that was dissolving into delirium. In the swirling fog of her fever, she had visions. She saw her mother's face, not as she remembered it, worn and tired, but young and smiling, humming the freedom song as she braided her hair. She saw the old itinerant preacher, his eyes burning with a fierce light as he spoke of a flame that could not be extinguished. She saw Leo's face, his eyes wide with terror, and her heart ached with a grief so profound it felt like a physical wound. The visions swirled and merged, and she dreamed she was the lantern. Her body was the tin and glass, battered and worn, but her spirit, her soul, was the flame inside, a small, steady light burning in the vast, wet darkness. And she knew, with the unshakable logic of a dream, that as long as that flame burned, she could not be extinguished. A flicker of clarity, a moment of instinct, broke through the delirium. Ilara's herbs, with fumbling, shaking hands, she found the small deerskin pouch. She didn't have the strength to make a fire for tea, so she did what she had seen Ilara do once. She took a pinch of the dried, bitter leaves, the yarrow and the snake root, and placed them in her mouth, chewing them into a bitter, pulpy mass. She swallowed, the taste acrid and foul, and then packed the rest of the poultice against her own hot skin. This was Dinah's symbolic death. In the dark, secret heart of the ancient Cypress, she was shedding the last vestiges of her old life, the last remnants of the person she had been. The fever was a fire, burning away the girl who polished silver, the woman who bowed her head and hid her hatred, the slave named Dinah Cooper. When the fever finally broke, days later, She emerged from the hollow tree into the gray light of a misty morning. She was a different being. She was weaker physically, her body thin and frail, but her spirit had been forged into something new, something harder, something that belonged not to a master or a plantation, but to the swamp itself. She was no longer running. She was home. She was no longer Dinah Cooper, slave. She was something else entirely. A week of wading through the stinking black water had stripped the fury from Alistair Beaumont's posse and replaced it with a sullen, weary dread. The swamp had declared war on them. Their fine clothes were shredded into rags by thorns and sawgrass. Their skin was a lumpy, inflamed canvas of insect bites, and their nerves were frayed to the point of breaking. The constant, oppressive humidity left them perpetually soaked in sweat, while the chilling water they trudged through seemed to suck the very marrow from their bones. 2 of the hired men had already quit, their bravado dissolving in the face of the swamp's relentless hostility. They spoke of a constant, unnerving feeling of being watched, of shadows that moved when they weren't looking, and of a silence that felt more menacing than any sound. The swamp fought them at every turn, with sucking mud that stole their boots, tangled roots that tripped them, and a disorienting landscape of identical trees that seemed to mock their sense of direction. Beaumont's initial hot-blooded rage had curdled into a cold, frustrated obsession. He pushed the remaining men relentlessly, his face a pale, grim mask of determination. He refused to be beaten by a slip of a girl and a patch of cursed mud. But the swamp was indifferent to his will. They would find tracks, clear as day in a patch of soft earth, follow them for 50 yards to the water's edge, and then nothing. The trail would simply vanish, swallowed by the black water, leaving them staring at their own haggard reflections. Finch, the overseer, who had begun the hunt with a cruel swagger, was now a man transformed by fear. He started at shadows, his eyes constantly darting into the dense thickets around them, his hand rarely leaving the hilt of the knife at his belt. The dogs, once eager for the chase, were now sullen and nervous, whining low in their throats and resisting the pull of their leashes. One evening, as the grim party made a miserable camp on a patch of ground barely solid enough to hold a fire, Finch finally approached his master. "It's no use, sir," he said, his voice a low, defeated rasp. "The swamp, it swallows everything. We've found where she entered the water a dozen times. It's like she was never here." Beaumont, who was staring into the fire as if he could find her face in the flames, turned his head slowly, his eyes glowing with a fanatical light. "She is here," he hissed, his voice dangerously quiet. "A slave doesn't just vanish into thin air, Finch. She is flesh and blood, and she is weak and afraid. She is in my swamp, and I will have her back." He rose to his feet and loomed over the frightened overseer. "Find her, or I'll have your hide tanning in the smokehouse where she should be working." From her hidden vantage points, Dinah watched them. She had become a creature of the swamp, her movements as silent as the mist, her presence as unobtrusive as a shadow. She was the rustle of leaves they dismissed as the wind. She was the ripple in the water they blamed on a fish. She was the snap of a twig they attributed to a squirrel. She watched their clumsy, loud progress, their frustration, their growing fear, and she felt a new and unfamiliar sensation, a feeling of power. They were the hunters, but she held the advantage. They were in her world now, and she knew its secrets. One night, as she watched their campfire flicker from a safe distance, a bold and daring idea took root in her mind. They were hunting a woman, a frightened, running slave. She would give them something else to hunt. She would give them a ghost. She took out her lantern, the lantern she had kept unlit since she had first hidden from the dogs. Her hands were steady now as she struck the flint and lit the wick. The small flame bloomed, a warm and gentle light in the vast darkness. She found a large, flat piece of cypress bark that had peeled from a dead tree and placed the lit lantern carefully in its center, wading silently into a channel of water that flowed in the direction of their camp. She gave the small raft a gentle push. The current caught it, and the light began to bob and weave through the skeletal trees, a phantom guide leading to nowhere. She watched it go, a solitary, impossible star drifting through the haunted darkness. And then she slipped away in the opposite direction. The men at the camp saw it. One of them, a man named Silas, was relieving himself at the edge of the clearing when he caught the flicker of light through the trees. He froze, his eyes wide. "Hey," he whispered, his voice tight with fear. "What is that?" The others turned, their hands instinctively going to their weapons. They saw it too, a small, steady light, moving where no light should be, gliding silently over the black water. It was too steady for a firefly, too low for a star. It moved with a purpose that was deeply unsettling. "A willow, the wisp," one of the men breathed, the old folk tale suddenly a terrifying reality. Finch stared, his face pale in the firelight. "No," he said, his voice trembling. "It's her. It's that witch's light." The sight of the phantom light shattered the last of their resolve. They were no longer hunting a person. They were being haunted. Dinah, hidden in the darkness a mile away, could not hear their words, but she could feel their fear. It was a palpable thing, a scent on the air, a vibration in the ground. She was no longer just hiding. She was actively manipulating her hunters. She was using their own fear, their own superstition, as a weapon. In the heart of the swamp, a profound power shift had occurred. The next day, defeated and demoralized, the posse followed the general direction the phantom light had taken, not with any real hope of finding Dinah, but because Beaumont, in his obsessive madness, commanded it. Their search led them to a place they had not yet been, a still, quiet bayou, where the water was as black and reflective as polished obsidian. The fog was thick here, clinging to the surface of the water and muffling all sound, creating an atmosphere of profound and sacred silence. And there, in the center of that silent bayou, they saw it, the lantern. It was floating perfectly upright, its base submerged just enough to be invisible, so that the glass and the flame seemed to be resting directly on the surface of the water. The small, steady flame within burned with a serene and unwavering light, a single point of warmth and color in a world of gray mist and black water. It seemed to hold the fog at bay, creating a small circle of impossible clarity around itself. It looked serene, holy, an offering left on the altar of the swamp. The men halted their horses at the water's edge, the animals shifting and snorting, their ears twitching nervously. The dogs, which had been listless all morning, now began to whine, a low, mournful sound, and they refused to go closer, their bodies pressed against the legs of the horses. Jeb, the tracker who had first spotted the light days ago, raised a trembling hand and pointed, his face a mask of chalky, superstitious terror. Alistair Beaumont stared, his mind, which was so adept at calculating profits and losses, simply unable to process the sight before him. It defied all logic, all reason. The oil should have been gone days ago. A week in the constant, penetrating damp should have ruined the wick, made it impossible to light. The slightest breeze, the gentlest current, should have tipped it over and extinguished it in the black water. Yet, it burned, it floated, it waited. His anger, the driving force of his entire life, the fuel that had burned in him for a week, was suddenly gone, replaced by a profound and terrifying awe. This was not the work of a runaway slave. This was not the act of a defiant woman. This was something else, a sign, a judgment. He felt the ancient, brooding presence of the swamp all around him, no longer just a physical obstacle, but a living entity, a power that had witnessed his cruelty and was now passing sentence. The small, impossible flame was its verdict. He felt a cold dread seep into his soul, a fear far deeper and more absolute than any fear he had ever inspired in his slaves. It was the fear of a man who has come face to face with a power he cannot own, cannot whip, and cannot comprehend. He had been defeated, not by the woman he was hunting, but by the mystery she had left in her place. With a voice that was barely a whisper, a voice devoid of all its former command, he spoke a single word: home. The hunt for Dinah, the human woman, was over. The posse returned to Memphis not with a captive, but with a story. They were gaunt, hollow-eyed men, their clothes in tatters, their minds haunted by what they had seen. They told their story in the smoky dimness of taverns, in the dusty half-light of stables, and in hushed, fearful tones on street corners. And with each telling, the story grew. The lantern, in their retellings, became brighter, its flame hotter, its glow more supernatural. They said the water around it wouldn't ripple, that it was as smooth as glass. They said the fog would not touch it. Some swore they had heard a woman singing, a low, mournful lullaby that seemed to come from the water itself. The story spread like wildfire through the town and the surrounding plantations, a dark and compelling piece of folklore taking root in the fertile soil of fear and superstition. Finch, broken by the experience, his authority and his cruelty washed away by the swamp's quiet judgment, quit his job as overseer and left town, disappearing to the west. Alistair Beaumont became a recluse. He rarely left the big house, and when he did, he seemed a smaller, older man. His back bent, his eyes constantly darting towards the dark line of the swamp on the horizon. He was a man haunted by the memory of a flame he could not extinguish, a light that had burned away his pride and left only a cold, lingering fear. The story needed a name, a title for its spectral protagonist. It was a group of children playing near the swamp's edge and scaring each other with the tale. Who first gave it one? They spoke of the woman who walked into the water and left her light behind, the woman who now guarded the misty depths. They say she's still out there. One child would whisper to another, their eyes wide in the gathering dusk. They call her the Lantern Lady now. The name stuck. Dinah Cooper, the slave, was gone, swallowed by the swamp. In her place, a legend was born. Years bled into decades, a river of time that washed away old grievances and carved new landscapes. The Civil War, a distant storm that had finally broken over the nation, came and went. its thunder shaking the very foundations of the world Dinah had known. The Beaumont plantation, once a symbol of absolute power, was gone. Its grand house burned to the ground in a fire of retribution, its fields slowly surrendering to the patient, the relentless advance of weeds and wildflowers. The world had changed, but the swamp remained, and so did the story. An elderly man, his back stooped from a lifetime of labor, first as a slave, and then as a free man, often walked to the edge of that swamp, especially when the evening mist was thick and the world seemed to hold its breath. It was Leo. His face was a beautiful, intricate map of wrinkles, but his eyes, when he looked toward the dark water, were as clear and bright as they had been when he was a boy. He never went in. He had no desire to follow her path, only to honor it. He would stand there for a long time, listening to the chorus of frogs and insects, searching the deepening shadows not for a ghost, but for a memory, a feeling. He told the story of his sister Dinah to his own children, and then to their children. But the story he told was not the one whispered in taverns by frightened men. In his telling, the fear was secondary to the courage, the mystery less important than the motive. He told them about her kindness, about the way she would hum freedom songs when she thought no one was listening, about the fierce, protective love in her eyes the day she stood between him and the whip. One cool evening, his young granddaughter, a girl with his own bright eyes, tugged on his sleeve as they stood at the swamp's edge. "Grandpa," she whispered, her voice full of the delicious fear of a child's ghost story. "Is it true? Is the lantern lady really out there?" Leo looked down at her, a soft smile touching his lips. He knelt, his old bones creaking, so he could look her in the eye. "They call her the lantern lady and they say she's a ghost," he said, his voice a low, gentle rumble. "But she's not a ghost, child. She's a promise that even in the deepest, darkest night, when you're scared and you feel all alone, you can carry your own light." He tapped a finger gently on her chest, right over her heart. "And that's a light no one, no master, no monster, no darkness can ever put out." He kept the woman alive, ensuring that beneath the shimmering myth, the heart of a brave human being continued to beat. The story flowed like the river, changing its course with the times, becoming a mirror for the souls who encountered it. In the late 1800s, two brothers, fishermen who knew the swamp's channels like the lines on their own hands, were caught in a sudden, disorienting fog, a white blindness that fell upon them without warning. They argued, their fear turning to anger, their voices sharp and loud in the unnatural quiet. They were lost, hopelessly turned around, the threat of spending a night in the gator-haunted black water a cold certainty in their hearts. Just as despair began to set in, they saw it, a gentle light, a soft, bobbing glow, moving through the trees. It did not frighten them, it calmed them. It felt like a friendly hand on the shoulder. Without speaking, the light seemed to keep a steady distance, leading them through a series of narrow, winding channels they had never seen before, until suddenly they broke through the fog bank and saw the familiar and wide expanse of the main river channel shimmering under the moonlight. They turned to thank whoever had guided them, but there was nothing there. The light was gone, and the swamp was silent once more. In the 1920s, during the height of Jim Crow, a young couple used the swamp's edge as their secret meeting place. He was a black sharecropper with hands calloused from picking another man's cotton, and she was the white daughter of a shopkeeper. Their love a dangerous, forbidden fire that could have gotten them both killed. They would meet in the shadows, their whispered words full of a desperate, yearning love and the constant, gnawing fear of discovery. One night, as they held each other, a twig snapped nearby, and they froze, their hearts pounding. But it was only a deer. As their breathing returned to normal, they saw a light in the distance, a soft, steady presence, bobbing gently over the water. They watched it for a long time, and it did not feel like a specter of death, but a silent, benevolent witness. They took it as a blessing on their union, a sign from the swamp itself that their love, in this wild place, was seen and accepted. The sight gave them a strange new courage, a feeling that they were not entirely alone in their struggle. And in the 1950s, a man running from the law, his hands stained with the blood of a bar fight gone wrong, plunged into the swamp to escape the posse he could hear in the distance. He was a hard man, full of a bitter, angry pride, and as he hid in the cold, stinking water, he felt a grim satisfaction at his own cunning. He had gotten away with it. He would disappear, start a new life. As night fell, he saw the light. It wasn't moving. It was just there, burning with a clear, unwavering flame in the distance. It felt like an eye, a calm, dispassionate eye that was looking directly into his soul. It did not accuse, it did not judge. It simply illuminated. In its pure, clean light, he saw the ugliness of what he had done, the pointless waste of his anger. The sight broke him. The hardness inside him cracked, and a lifetime of grief and regret poured out. He wept, his shoulders shaking, his sobs muffled by the chorus of the frogs. The next morning, he walked out of the swamp, his hands held high, and surrendered to the law, ready to face his punishment. The lantern lady had become a multifaceted symbol, what the person seeing her needed her to be. To the lost, she was a guide. To the forbidden, a guardian. To the guilty, a specter of conscience. But the legend was a story, and the story had a source, a woman of flesh and blood whose heart had beat with fear and courage. Deep in the swamp's hidden heart, far from any path or channel known to men, an old woman sat by a small, smoky fire. It was Dinah. She was not a ghost. She was the swamp's secret. Time had weathered her, carving its own story into her face. Her skin was as tough and textured as cypress bark. Her hair was a wild mane, the color of Spanish moss, and her eyes, clear and dark, held the deep, quiet wisdom of the wild. She was a creature of this place, as much a part of it as the ancient trees and the black water. Her home was a dry, hidden cave, its entrance veiled by a curtain of thick, hanging vines. Here, she was not just surviving, she was living a life of absolute, solitary freedom. Her gnarled but nimble fingers worked deftly, mending a fishing net she had woven herself from tough, fibrous vines. She moved with a slow, deliberate grace, her body attuned to the rhythms of her world. On a high ledge of rock inside the cave, the original lantern Saturday. It was an artifact now, a relic of a life lived a lifetime ago. The tin was rusted and pitted, the glass cloudy with the smoke of 1,000 nights, but it was still cared for, its surface wiped clean of dust. She no longer needed it. Her eyes had long ago adjusted to the subtle light of the moon and stars filtering through the canopy, and she knew the swamp's every path and secret by heart, by feel, by scent. Sometimes, in the quiet moments before sleep, she would think of her old life. It felt like a distant, faded dream, a story someone had told her long ago. The faces of Alistair and Eleanor Beaumont were like smudged charcoal drawings, their cruelty a distant hollow echo. The anger, the hatred that had once burned so hot within her, was gone, washed away by the slow, patient waters of the swamp, replaced by a vast and quiet peace. She felt a kinship now, not with people, but with the silent, ancient trees, the patient, flowing water, the shy, watchful animals who were her only neighbors. She had heard the stories, lost fishermen and frightened children stumbling into her domain, had sometimes seen her from a distance, a fleeting shape in the mist, and their tales had been carried out of the swamp on the wind. She knew they called her the Lantern Lady. A slow smile would touch her lips when she thought of it. She understood, with a clarity that was its own form of peace, that her true legacy was not her own quiet, hidden life, but the story that had grown from her single, desperate act of courage. That story was a light, and it could travel farther than she ever could, touching lives she would never know. And that, she knew, was a freedom better and more profound than any she had ever imagined. The world changed again. The present day arrived, with its noise and its speed, and its desperate need to pave over mystery. At the edge of a preserved section of the great Cypress swamp, a memorial park had been built, a place where tourists could walk on raised wooden boardwalks and look at the tamed wilderness from a safe distance. A young historian, a woman with a passion for forgotten stories, stood before a bronze plaque, taking notes in a small book. The plaque told a sanitized, brief version of the local legend. It spoke of the folklore of the Lantern Lady, of a runaway slave who disappeared into the swamp in the 1830s, and of the unexplained phenomenon of her lantern, which was said to appear as a mysterious light to travelers lost in the fog. An old woman, sitting on a nearby bench, watched the historian with kind, knowing eyes. She was wrapped in a brightly colored shawl, her hair a crown of silver braids, her skin the rich dark color of the swamp's earth. She saw the historian finish her notes and look up, her expression a mixture of academic interest and a faint, unsatisfied curiosity. "The sign has some of it right," the old woman said, her voice warm and melodic, "but it leaves out the most important part." The historian, startled, turned to her. "Oh, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to disturb you." "You're not disturbing me, child," the woman said with a smile. "You're looking for a story. I can see it in your eyes." The historian smiled back. "I am. What's the important part that the sign leaves out?" The old woman's gaze drifted from the historian to the dark water of the swamp beyond the boardwalk. Her smile faded, replaced by a look of profound ancestral reverence. "They say her lantern was found still burning," she said, her voice dropping to a near whisper. "And they talk about it like it's a miracle. But the real miracle wasn't the lantern." She turned her eyes back to the young historian, and they shone with a powerful, inherited light. The real miracle was the woman who lit it. The words hung in the air, simple and immense. The historian stood frozen, the pen falling from her fingers. In that moment, The folklore became history. The myth became a woman. She looked from the old woman's powerful living face to the dark, mysterious swamp, and she finally understood. The camera of the mind pans away from them, leaving the historian to ponder the weight of that truth. It moves over the manicured boardwalk, over the edge of the preserved land, and into the wild, untamed heart of the swamp that still lay beyond the reach of men. The evening mist, timeless and eternal, begins to gather, swirling over the black water and weaving through the skeletal arms of the cypress trees. The world grows quiet, hushed, waiting, and deep within the shadows, where no tourist could ever see, where the wild heart of the swamp beats on, for just a single, fleeting moment, a tiny, warm pinprick of light flickers on, just as quickly disappears.